just to say that we have had a slight change in our programme this afternoon. So our next speaker is going to be Rachel Barclay, and then Frances Larson will be speaking after her. So just to introduce Rachel, she's the curator at the Oriental Museum in Durham. And she studied ancient Egyptian and Akkadian at Oxford University, at the same time participating in excavations in the tombs of the nobles in Luxor in Egypt as a part of a team from Cambridge University. She then spent several years working in international marketing across Southern Europe, North Africa and China before returning to the museum sector to join the Pitt Rivers Museum. And since moving to Durham, she's led the programme to completely redisplay the Oriental Museum's permanent galleries. So I know she's very much heavily involved in the university's teaching across a range of departments, and internationally she's worked on Durham University research projects and partnerships with museums in China, Japan, Malaysia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Taiwan and Vietnam. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rachel. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Emily. And thank you very much to Ken and everyone at Swansea for setting this up today. It's always nice to come back to Egypt, which was my first love before I got seduced by everything else. So yes, I'm going to be the first of the curators to really talk about what's happened to the Wellcome collections since they've arrived in our museums. So for those of you who don't know the Oriental Museum, this is it. We opened in 1960. As John said earlier this afternoon, he gave me a fantastic introduction, so I should thank John as well very much. We were originally the Gulbenkian Museum of Oriental Art and Archaeology, so rather a mouthful, but it was shortened in the 1980s to what was then a much less contentious name and has now become a much more difficult name. We're a rather anonymous looking box south of the city, most attractive in the spring when the cherry blossoms out. But it is rather TARDIS-like, so when you get inside, it is much bigger than it looks on the outside, and hopefully more exciting too. We started as a departmental museum, as John said earlier, attached to the School of Oriental Studies, but we now support teaching and research right across the university rather than for a single department. But also, yes, our public remit has grown, and this ties in with what Alan was saying about Swansea earlier as well. Originally, we were only open to the public 2 afternoons a week, and we really weren't that keen on them coming in. But now, in normal times, we're open 7 days a week. At the moment, it's 5 days a week to give me 2 days to do my university teaching in the galleries in a COVID-safe way. But Wednesday to Sunday, we are now open again to the public. And our communities, the schools, the artists, the face groups who all use the museum are just as important to us as our university audiences. In terms of the collections, my boss likes to joke that our founders use the word Orient to mean east of Lowestoft, because it's a rather broad collection for the word Orient. So here, the largest 2 collections are the China and the ancient Egyptian and Sudanese collections. This gives you a flavour of the other major collections that we have. But the reality is there is South American material, there is Pacific material, there's European material. So it's a really broad range of collections. And there are 2 of us. Again, as John was saying earlier, there were 2 curators back in the early 70s. That went down to 1 for some considerable time. But as of this year, I do also have someone else working with me. So we've got this huge range of collections, but really we don't have the time to research them. We're really relying on our students and our external researchers to undertake the research, and we facilitate that. And you'll see this has been one of the problems for the Wellcome collection. But before I focus in on Egypt, I do just want to mention our broader Wellcome collections. So the first group that came into us in 1956 was just over 200 objects from the Lachish excavations that Henry Wellcome co-sponsored. If you want an Egypt connection, they are Lachish is mentioned in the Amarna letters. But then, yes, 1971, the big Egyptian archaeology transfer comes over to us. You'll see a question mark by the 4,000 objects, and I will come back to that. And then in 1981, we were lucky enough to receive what is described in the sort of usual notes on the Wellcome distribution as Asian metalwork. 275 objects or thereabouts. It does include metalwork, so things like lovely Chinese mirrors, like the one you can see here, but also things like Islamic footwear and Japanese leather and lacquer armour, which is a rather broad definition of metalwork. And we were lucky enough when Fran Larson, our next speaker, was here in Durham for a short period of time, that she worked on this particular collection for us. And I guess my appeal to the Egyptologists here in the room is don't forget to talk to the other folk in your museum who also have Wellcome collections, because there are definitely connections to be made between the different parts that came into us all. But to come back to Egypt, I want to talk first about the Northumberland Collection, and it's lovely that John mentioned this earlier. It was not in any way planned, so thank you very much, John, because I think the fact the Northumberland Collection was here had undoubtedly a significant impact on what happened next with the Wellcome Collection. So this is Algernon Percy, the 4th Duke of Northumberland. He started collecting in the 1820s when he first visited Egypt and fell in love with it, both ancient Egypt and modern Egypt of the day, and collected through to his death in 1865. Once he becomes Duke, he can't continue visiting Egypt, but he does have all of the wealth of the Duchy of Northumberland at his disposal to indulge his habit, and he does. So we know that he's buying from auctions. So, for instance, the statue of Seneb that you can see here, and I'm hoping it's looking less blurry for the rest of you than it is slightly on my screen at the moment. We know that's bought from Henry Salt's 3rd collection at the 1835 sale in Sotheby's, and the image from the auction catalogue is there. He also becomes good friends with a number of leading Egyptologists of the day, particularly John Gardner Wilkinson, who studies the collections and then uses them in his publications. And again, here you can see one of the boxes of Per Pouty and then the illustrations from Wilkinson's publication. Following on from this, in 1880, as John said, Samuel Birch of the British Museum is employed to publish a lavish catalogue that was distributed to the major libraries. Algernon's not the only collector. There's also Henry, Lord Warkworth, who later became Earl Percy. He's interested in ancient Egypt and also the ancient Near East, as you can see from the selection of objects that he added to the collection here. Unfortunately, he died very prematurely at the age of 40 in 1909. But we do have a letter on file from the 10th Duke from the late 1940s saying that Henry's aim was to fill the gaps in his uncle's collection. And you can see that in his collecting, but I think the Wellcome material that came into the museum does that even more. But it does mean that when the Wellcome material arrived, there were around 2,500 objects already here that were already quite well known and included some really fantastic pieces. So I've been joking for years that the Wellcome collection was a very welcome addition, and I've been giving all the credit to John. And when we got together to have a brief chat before this conference, he denied that it was in any way to his credit whatsoever. But when you look at the material that came into us, it definitely did fill the gaps. So it includes things like pre-dynastic material, late period and Christian material that really is very lacking or completely absent from the Northumberland collection. And it also addresses depth in terms of some types of materials, so things like faience cartonnage, like the wonderful mummy mask that I'll come back to later in the talk. John Ruffle did come to Durham in the 1980s as our curator here, so it's really interesting that the two Johns did the division for Birmingham and Durham together. And John Ruffle, unfortunately, not terribly well these days, so unable to join us, always used to joke that he was really annoyed with himself because when he and John Baines were doing the division, he tried to keep stuff for Birmingham that he was particularly excited about and then lived to regret it when he then came to Durham in the 1980s and really wished that he had let John Baines have more of it for Durham. But he always said to me that he really felt that John Baines had thoroughly planned it and knew what he wanted and had a really clear picture of what he needed. So you can decide between you how that one actually worked. But if we look at what came in, one of the points I want to make is how significant this collection was for us overall. So we are, in museum terms, quite young. As I say, we only opened in 1960. Collecting only began in 1949. There were 20 objects accessioned in 1949. And as you can see, during the 50s, we built up the initial collection. But if you look at the red here and the contribution that Wellcome makes, at the moment, Wellcome is the single largest source of collections to the museum. At the moment, we're cataloguing a collection of South Asian photography that will overtake it in terms of numbers, but at the moment on our database, Wellcome's the big one, which I think makes it all the more sad that it hasn't really received the attention that it deserves, considering how important it is to us. But I think there are a number of reasons for that, and I want to go into those today. It's going to be a warts and all presentation, this. I'm not going to hide our failings from you. So unfortunately for us, John Baines did leave us not long after the material came into us. And as he said earlier, only a small amount had been unpacked before he left. The vast majority of it was still in tea chests. And it stayed that way until 1974. And we have this handwritten ledger from 1974, which explains what happened. And the handwriting is terrible to read, so I've written it out for you. This collection was contained in tea chests with no lists or identification when I took up work as custodian in Jan 1974. I've identified it and listed it as per this catalogue, but have failed to persuade any official or to check or identify it. I have found no documentation of receipt. I'm told it was but a casual gift from the BM. So as John has mentioned earlier, our curators at the time were a China specialist and a South Asia specialist, and you can see that this fantastic edition had just been rather forgotten. So this list was made, but as you can also hopefully see, it is rather lacking in detail, because the poor person, I've yet to identify the signature, but the poor person really didn't know what they were looking at. And this really sort of started the trend that has hindered it ever since. As I say, John Ruffle arrived in the 1980s. The card catalogue from that period is much better. He was the one who then initiated digital database. But it's really only been since the collections went online in 2015 that people have actually been able to know about this collection. Whereas for the Northumberland Collection, you have the 1880 catalogue, it's in every major Egyptological library. People still email me on a regular basis with references from that catalogue asking for information. How's anyone going to know about this collection? How are they going to know it's here to research? So that's really been one of the issues right from the start. The other thing I think is also that the composition of the collection didn't help. When I was doing a sort of an analysis ahead of this talk, it really struck home to me, something that I'd kind of instinctively known but never added up, is it's an awful lot of small things. So by far the largest category of object are the amulets. So there's more than 1,000 amulets before you add in the additional jewellery. When you look at the vessels, they tend to be very everyday vessels rather than sort of glamorous royal vessels like the Northumberland ones. Lots of scarabs, lots of small figurines and statuettes and so on. A huge range of material, but very little of it is the big glamorous stuff that tends to get put on display or get published or that people in the past have been interested in, and thankfully that is changing. But I think that has also hindered it, the lack of sort of the big glossy headline objects. Even when they exist, and I said I would come back to this lovely mummy mask, they weren't always helped by the documentation situation. So it's interesting to hear that Aidan is here with us today. He is the one who identified this mask. When it come in, and he can correct me in the chat if I get this wrong, but my understanding from what he told me several years ago is that it got put in a cupboard. It had been assigned as being Ptolemaic and sort of put away. And it was only when he was here researching something else, the cupboard got opened, that he saw this and realised what it was, and that it's actually a New Kingdom mask from around about 1500 BCE. And the small face, the sort of slightly out of proportion sizing of the face, is a remnant of the Rishi masks that you see from 100 years earlier. So thanks to Aidan, it's been got out the cupboard, it's been conserved, it's now on display. And to me, it serves as a daily reminder of the importance of opening the box, opening the cupboard, not trusting the record when it comes to the collections. And over the last 10 years, yes, I have been slightly more than that now. I've been redisplaying the whole of the Oriental Museum. The final gallery will open very, very soon. We have two ancient Egypt galleries, one set up for schools, the one you can see on the left, and the one on the right, our sort of treasures gallery, which has very low lighting, which makes it impossible to photograph. So apologies for the slightly moody lighting in the one on the right. The great thing about starting again is we have been able to reconsider what's on display. And so now about a quarter of the objects on display are Wellcome objects. We went back through the whole collection. It is still dominated by Northumberland, but there's also material from the EES, from the Rawnsley collection, from some of our other smaller collections. So we have been able to address the balance in some ways in terms of display, and that always helps to attract people to study the collections. But this has also highlighted one of the other problems that I did want to mention. The little group of earrings and studs down on the right-hand side here are in the jewellery displays in the education gallery. And I'm pretty sure that they are Wellcome material, but they have no acquisition information on the database. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed on the chart I showed of the decades of development of the collection, there are around 3,000 Wellcome objects for the 1970s, rather than the 4,000 that it suggested came to us. And my current working theory is that, as John said, when the material arrived here in Durham, some boxes got opened, but that material didn't get catalogued straight away. The majority of the boxes languished till 1974. But in the meantime, the boxes that got opened got absorbed into the stores, and that connection to Wellcome got lost along the way. So we have potentially sort of 1,000 Wellcome objects in limbo, being used, but without that connection to Wellcome. There has also been a tendency, if an object is particularly nice, to assume it's Northumberland rather than Wellcome. So there's a lot to do, and I'll finish off with coming on to that in a couple of minutes. I don't want it to be entirely negative, though. I don't want you to think I don't love this collection, because I do. There are actually some fantastic advantages to this collection and what has happened to it, which we can make the most of. And interestingly, one of those is the poor cataloguing of the objects. So the picture on the right is one of my favourite images from our teaching during lockdown. So Penny Wilson has been mentioned earlier, I think, who is our Egyptologist here in the archaeology department, and also an EES dig director. This is Penny teaching online. Penny is on this student's mobile phone. So we've been able to continue running our teaching during lockdown with me in the room, the student in the room with his object, and Penny on Zoom on a phone, or other times on a laptop. But what we're doing here is Penny's advanced hieroglyphs course, where the students get to pick an object which is badly described and has an inscription on it that hasn't been translated, and then they do the translations for us. And it's a fantastic practical thing for the students to do. Other students doing summer placements then add that information to our database. I am hoping that in the audience this afternoon are 4 of my students who have just started a placement with us, who are going to be working on improving the cataloguing of the Wellcome collection. We do a similar thing with our master's students doing museum studies. They're given an artifact every year, and they're often Wellcome objects, so they can go and pester Penny about those. So actually having real live projects for students to work on is brilliant. The fakes and forgeries that have also been mentioned, they're really useful. The one in the middle here is from a project that one of Penny's PhD students worked on with us. And of course, teaching what a real thing looks like is sometimes really handy to have a fake or a forgery. So I don't think we should be ashamed of them. I think we should be using them. And then the other thing when we've been doing the redisplay is all those small things that I think initially hindered the collection. They are fantastic for displays of daily life. And any of the curators who are in the room today who have done redisplays in recent years will know that this features on the national curriculum for schools. And if you have a collection that is all about royal objects, priestly objects, big and blingy, beautiful bits of stone, it's quite hard to create displays on daily life. But when you have lots of smaller things or more everyday pottery, then you can create those displays. And so that's really where the Wellcome collection has come into its own in supporting our schools teaching in recent years. And then to finish off, I want to look at the work in progress. What's going on? We were lucky enough during lockdown to obtain funding from the AHRC to completely refurbish our stores. And having taken everything out and putting everything back, we have also then been able to get funding for a member of staff to come in and do a full audit of the collection, every curator's dream. So over the next 14 months, we will be doing a complete audit of the entire collection. And we are hoping in that process to at least find out where the problems are, even if we can't solve all of the problems. As I say, we have students working at the moment on improving the catalogue records, and this is so useful, this conference. I've been scribbling notes already for things that we can add. Photography is another really big one. Unfortunately, we lost our photographer in University Cuts a few years ago, but this year, with the need to supply lots of new photographs for online teaching, we've been lucky enough to get a part-time photographer back. So we want to put in place a new program of photography. And of course, we all know when you're looking at an online database, it's so much easier when you can see the thing rather than just read the description. The link up with the Wellcome archives is wonderful. Getting in touch with Alexandra, who's been mentioned several times already, and who I'm really looking forward to hearing speak on Friday, has been brilliant. And the ability to start joining all the dots is wonderful. Doing all this provenance research and making the links to other collections. The final image I have on the bottom here, Ken will recognise as one of his labels. And I do just want to finish by giving him so much credit, because he really has been the one who has brought us all together and has driven all of this. And I have learned so much in the last couple of years from Ken. I think he knows our Wellcome collection better than anyone here in Durham. So there is so much more we can do, and I'm hoping that this conference will lead, as Ken was saying, to other workshops, potentially grant bids, other ways of us working together on this collection. So I'll leave it there with this lovely, rather grumpy looking best jar, which my learning team tell us is their favourite object from our Wellcome collections. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It was really interesting, and I think sounds really promising, all the work that is to be done. I think one of the perks of working in museums is always work to be done, and that's a good thing for us in terms of that. We do have a couple of questions that Carolyn Graves has asked about some flint from Bowen and whether or not that's on display now. I don't know if you know that she's referring to there.
I do know what she's referring
Rachel?
to. Yes, yes, I do know the ones Carolyn's referring to. And no, they're not, because we had a new donation of flint, and so I have those on display instead. But they're still there and still loved and treasured. Right. Yeah.
And then she just made a comment to say Wellcome was quite happy to buy replicas if he couldn't get the originals. So I think that just feeds in quite nicely with the idea of there being a teaching opportunity in terms of kind of fake replicas, forgeries and things like that.
Yeah.
And you've already mentioned about Alexandra Everly's talk on Friday, which is really interesting in terms of all the work with Transcribe Wellcome. So hopefully with some of the audit work that's coming up and some of that, we might be able to do some more collections reconciliation, which will be another wonderful opportunity to kind of engage with that material.
Yeah, we are very excited about that, yes.
I'm just seeing if there's any other questions coming through in the chat. I'll just keep an eye on that. We have got a couple of minutes, so if there are any questions we want to ask, please take the opportunity. And for anything that we don't have time to now, try and answer chat anyway. So Isabella, oh, questions are moving all the time. Let me just see if there's any more. No. I think we're waiting for that later. I was going to ask, do you have a favourite item that's from the Wellcome collection at Durham?
Do I have a favourite one? No, I don't think I do. What I do love is the breadth of it, particularly the amulets. The amulet drawers are probably my favourite part of the collection, yeah, overall, because there's just such a breadth of material in there, and it's always a pleasure to open them and sort of have a route through. So yeah, that would have to be my choice.
Brilliant. And what about from the Northumberland collection?
That's even more impossible. That changes on a daily basis. I mean, the most well-known one is the servant girl, and yeah, she is fantastic. But again, oh, I don't know. I think it's an impossible question to ask any curator, really, isn't it? Because it changes depending on what you're doing and what you're working on. So yeah, we're just very lucky, and it's a lovely sort of, as I say, it's a lovely mixture of material, having the Northumberland collection, which is your classic 19th century sort of collection. The Wellcome material is different. Then we do have some excavated material from the EES, which obviously gives us things that link to excavations in a way that this material doesn't, and a couple of other smaller collections. So yeah, it's that breadth and variety that's really lovely.
No, that's great. And then just maybe a final question from me about the opportunities perhaps you've had to work on this collection during the last 18 months with lockdowns and closures. Have you been able to discover more about the collections during that time, as opposed to kind of being on site and business as usual?
The honest answer to that is no, because we have been on site all the way through. So we didn't get sent home, really. We've been here so we can, as a skeleton staff, so we can support university teaching. So either live streaming out or getting students in when we can and doing digitisation. And then, yes, getting the funding to do the stores project was absolutely fantastic, because normally that kind of funding is rare as rocking horse manure, so to speak. But getting that funding was absolutely brilliant, but it meant everything else sort of had to be squeezed in around it, because we had 5 months from getting the money to having to finish. So getting everything out, installing the new stores and getting everything back in. So yes, I'm very jealous of those people who've been sitting at home and had time for research, because it hasn't really worked that way for us. I think we're quite unusual that we've been here all the way through.